Good afternoon and welcome everyone to today's presentation, Integrating Ethics into Agency Initiatives and Building Ethical Culture. I'm Patrick Shepard. I'm a senior instructor here at OGE's Institute for Ethics in Government, and I'm very excited about today's presentation. We're very fortunate to be joined by Daniel Fishman, the designated agency ethics official at the National Endowment for the Arts. Daniel is the Assistant General Counsel and Designated Agency Ethics Official at NEA. He joined NEA in 2012 and has remained with the agency in various capacities since. He takes great joy in supporting the agency's work, fostering and sustaining an environment in which the arts benefit everyone in the United States, and he has degrees from George Washington University School of Law and the NYU Tisch School of the Arts. Prior to law school, he was a media professional in New York City, focusing on film making and sound design. So we're very, very fortunate to be joined today by Daniel Fishman. I'm very much looking forward to your presentation. And on behalf of the Institute for Ethics in Government, really want to thank you for taking the time to share your experience and expertise with us. And I think particularly with this topic, it's an area where applied expertise is infinitely more valuable than any of the sort of theory we could offer from the oversight office, the policy office at OGE. So we're very fortunate to have you here today. Very much looking forward to the presentation. And with that, I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you so much, Patrick. Thank you to everybody at OGE for setting this up. I am, as Patrick said, I come from the National Endowment for the Arts. I'll say NEA throughout the presentation. We're a small agency of about 150 people, and the ethics team operates out of a relatively small general counsel's office. So our team touches on most of what the agency does. And because of the small nature of our team, those of you who work at small agencies might understand this dynamic. The expertise of a particular shop necessarily gets shared by everybody that works through the same or similar issues. So we're in a unique position as a small agency to accomplish what the name of this presentation is: integrating ethics into agency initiatives and building ethical culture. What we're going to be doing today is I'm going to be discussing what you as an ethics practitioner should be thinking about and how to think through issues that come up when you are brought in, not simply as a person implementing discrete aspects of the standards of ethical conduct, analyzing a gift, dealing with a conflict of interest, but thinking proactively about your role as an ethics practitioner in bringing the scope of what the agency intends to do with its mission and the authority that it was given. And that's going to specifically focus on the role we play and best practices. If you've come to this presentation looking for an audit checklist of what to think of when you receive a proposal for some kind of initiative, I'm sorry to say that I don't have one of those for you. And I think throughout the presentation, you'll understand why. The understanding of how I look at initiatives and how our teamwork looks at initiatives is, it's necessarily a holistic approach, because it takes a broad view of what our role is as ethics practitioners in terms of understanding what your agency is trying to accomplish and how the rules and the standards of ethical conduct play into that. A couple other housekeeping notes. I'm going to share some examples throughout this. I'm sure there will be plenty of time to share war stories. During this first part, I'm going to be giving examples that aren't necessarily going to be drawn from war stories. I'm going to be giving generic examples. But as you all think of or are willing to share during the Q&A portion, which will follow in a little bit, if you all have war stories or scenarios you want to that you think might be instructive of a particular principle, again, as part of the unrecorded portion, if you wanted to go through some of those and share those with the group here, that would be welcome, in addition to any questions that you might have. Sharing lessons learned is one of the best tools that I have had in figuring my way through the ethics process. And um, just the other note about me, as Patrick said, I've been working in this space since I was a lowly intern at my agency in 2012. I've been it's been a great privilege to work with everybody at OGE and to be a part of this community, and it's a real pleasure to be presenting this to everybody today. So thank you to everybody. In terms of what we're approaching here today, again, integrating ethics into agency initiatives and building ethical culture. The key word in this, in the challenge of doing this, is collaboration. We are not, as ethics officials, an island. We exist in a context of an agency that is trying to pursue a mission. And the mission is important, and doing so with the utmost integrity is important. You've heard a variation on this sentiment throughout any presentation that focuses on not just the technicalities, but on how to go about your job as an ethics practitioner. But I want to frame what we do in this context, in the context of looking at your agency's programmatic objectives of the initiative being proposed as a collaboration. We're all here to make sure that what our government accomplishes is done with the utmost integrity and that that adheres to a particular standard. And that process is inherently collaborative. It's you bringing something to the table as an ethics practitioner that will end up making the results of the initiative being proposed better, not just compliant, but better. And that's a key mindset to have here as a collaborator. It involves understanding, it involves listening, it involves accepting ideas and premises and understanding what the folks on the ground who are dealing with and trying to propose these initiatives are trying to get at in the first place. When I say initiatives, what do I mean? Broadly, I mean the programmatic, non-routine projects your agency undertakes in service of its mission. And I have a list of things up here. I'm sorry, I'm on slide 3. I may not be able to see some of the chat, I'm realizing here. So if anybody has technical requirements or anything, Patrick, just jump in and interject. But I'm on slide 3 right now, and I did promise Patrick I would let everybody know when I was advancing in slides for those who are following along in another way. So I'm on slide 3 right now, and on slide 3 there's a list of initiatives that might take of examples of ways that initiatives can come to us. Sometimes they won't be called initiatives, sometimes they'll become called programs or partnerships. Sometimes they'll come in the form of transactional agreements like cooperative agreements, grants, donation agreements if you have that, or just a proposal for a new use of your agency's inherent authority. These are all ways in which things come to us where a question might be asked, what's the best way to go about this? So there's 3 main topics I'm going to talk about in terms of forming these initiatives. The first is going to be the role of the ethics practitioner. What do we play and how do we conceive of our role as ethics practitioners in taking on a particular project? And the takeaway from that is that there's not one way to conceive of it, but you should be considering your role with intention, because it will shape how you can affect the process. Applying the standards of ethical conduct. I said this wasn't going to be a presentation with an audit checklist, but we are going to discuss the standards of ethical conduct. And in doing so, we're going to talk through an example of how issues can arise in a few discrete subject matter areas that might apply. And then we're going to go through very briefly some best practices that I've developed or pay attention to in the course of integrating ethics guidance into advising on agency initiatives. So the first here, the role of the ethics practitioner, and I'm on slide 5, I believe now, and moving on to slide 6. So the first big inflection point you have when thinking about an initiative is whether your role as a practitioner is going to focus on advising versus vetting. And this may be this is an easy point, and it may depend on how the project comes to you. But I want to distinguish these 2 approaches here because I think they They change how you can deal with and shape a project. By advising, I'm talking about reviewing a project early on, giving advice and steering the direction of a project from an early standpoint. By vetting, I mean approving projects, giving clear answers to questions that come through in regards of, can we do this? Can't we do this? Yes or no? Being a gatekeeper, and that word can have negative connotations, but it also might sometimes be the literal function of an ethics practitioner to review a particular proposal to make sure it's compliant with all the standards that we set forth here. And conducting that essential vetting of a particular program as maybe assigned by your office. There's a third one that I don't have here, and that is kind of the hall monitor function, which is something has gone wrong and you need to look at a program retrospectively. But that belongs to a different set of that belongs to a different presentation and a different subject. What the right role is for you to take on in a particular project as an ethics practitioner is going to be dictated by a few different things. And it's key to consult with management, general counsel, and anybody who is involved in the flow of formulating these projects to understand what the best approach is. There may be times when vetting approach is highly appropriate and highly useful, where you need to be looking at something in a very functional way and understanding, does this lock into a particular view of does this align with the standards of ethical conduct? But there's a lot of opportunities in advising and taking that approach. It allows you to be more fluid because you're not, because usually when advising is when your program folks are receptive to advising, they are not, the project is less fully baked, and that there's more of a collaborative opportunity to shape a particular project and to steer its direction. I'll talk about an idea that's come up in terms of forming your role as an ethics practitioner that's guided a lot of how I practice, and that's this idea of organizational conflicts. This is a word I borrowed from a piece of guidance that wasn't directly ethics related, but came up, I believe, through some third-party guidance explaining public-private partnerships that I read a few years ago, and I've been trying to credit and find the source of it for many years, and I have not quite been able to recall where it was from. So if anybody knows, or if this jumps out to anybody, please inform me and help me lock that down. But when I think of organizational conflicts, I don't think of just a standard, straight up, is this a 208 issue? Is this a 502 issue? Do we have a conflict of interest here? Thinking about conflicts on more of an organizational level. If a project conflicts with your organization's values or impedes other priorities, it's going to create an environment where violations of the standards of ethical conduct are way more likely to occur. The example I have on this slide is if your agency has a program that awards a substantial portion of the agency's budget to a single awardee, that might not per se violate any ethics rules, but it does create an environment where the possibility of an endorsement or misuse of position issue is heightened. So understanding that when those things come through, that it can be our role as ethics practitioners to not just identify specific issues, but to advise on the course of how certain programs are going to go, so that violations become less likely. So you're dealing with these issues up front, and that we have an understanding of how to, you have an understanding of how and when issues might arise to approach. It doesn't mean that an initiative has to be knocked out because it contains a thing that you might identify as this conflict, but you might shape or guide your organization in a way that mitigates it. And I'll give a shout out here also to enterprise risk management. If you haven't gone through the Institute for Ethics in Government Introduction to Enterprise Risk Management course, I really commend that to anybody who works on agency initiatives. The best I can boil it down in a sentence is assessing the best use of your resources as an ethics practitioner to lowering the risk of violations. But I am and the presentation is sufficiently thorough that I can't get into it here. But understanding enterprise risk management as an approach here will help define your role in approaching some of the issues that come up with this kind of programmatic advising.
And we'll drop a link to that presentation on the IAG course page for this presentation for everyone's convenience.
Thank you so much, Patrick. So I'll move on here to applying the standards of ethical conduct. That's we're advancing 2 slides at this point. I'm going to give 3 examples of ways that standards of ethical conduct can apply to an initiative, and discuss how they might how those might apply. There are obviously more ways in which the standards of ethical conduct or potential violations or organizational risks can arise through addressing standards of ethical conduct issues. So this is not intended to be exhaustive by any means, but I want to give these as examples. First off, they're ones that through talking with other practitioners and through my own practice, I've discovered have come up with some frequency. But also that they are they're instructive on kind of the things that might raise flags in terms of the standards of ethical conduct here. So for all of these, we're going to talk through what the issues are, and then we're going to talk through some of the potential solutions to those issues. So I'll have the rules up on the screen. Endorsement, we're hanging out in section 702 of the standards of ethical conduct. An employee, the broad rule being that you're not supposed to use your public office for endorsement of any product, service, or enterprise, and specifically in relation to your title or position or any authority associated with your office. You're not supposed to be endorsing your own personal activities. And moving on a slide, you're not supposed to be using your title to promote anything unless you have statutory authority to do so, or if you're trying to document compliance with standards or requirements or as recognition for achievement under an agency program. Straightforward. OGE has done many great presentations on endorsement as well.
So I'll jump right back in where we were. We talked about endorsement and where those and what the basic underlying rule is there. I don't know if anybody if my audio dropped out during an earlier part of that, but I think we can go back over. The rules on endorsement are well understandable through other avenues. The issues that can come up with endorsement are, we've seen this issue come up when projects with a certification element are included. Your agency may have the authority to issue these, which solves for the endorsement issue. But sometimes when you bring in other project partners, there may be an assumption that you would be able to certify or recognize a standard that might blend into it, that a well-meaning programmatic person might blend into endorsement in a slightly, otherwise, it might blend into an endorsement in an unintentional way. It may be very innocuous. It's also not. It's also in many circumstances not permissible. So you need to be able to understand understand when that dynamic is taking place, that might raise endorsement issues. Issues might also come up or be more likely to come up when there's a very central project partner that is working very closely with the agency from outside of from outside. If you're in partnership with an outside entity, you're not going to have, there's going to be a lot of ways you can communicate about that, where there's not going to be a real concern about endorsement, but it can stray into that territory depending on how central that project becomes, depending on how focused that is. You're not supposed to. It can become a factor in a potential endorsement if you have a project partner that is so central to a particular initiative that your employees' support of your project partner turns into the kind of maybe puffery or promotion that you would not want to see in an endorsement fact pattern. Also, be on the lookout for other agency activities involving that partner. Let's say, for example, you have a project partner that is perfect for a particular initiative that's being proposed. It's a non-competitive opportunity. But this is an entity that also works with your agency in other ways and is applying for competitive opportunities in other contexts. The dangers associated with that endorsement fact pattern get heightened in that situation. So it's something to be on the lookout for. Now, in these scenarios, we don't just talk about, well, you can't do the project because of that. That's where we go back to collaboration. You want to make sure that you're working with the people who are pushing these priorities to figure out the way that's best to do that. And thinking about this fact pattern, endorsement is a great way to think about mitigation. So what are ways you can potentially mitigate an endorsement or an appearance of endorsement? Well, one is a disclaimer. Many of us on this call are maybe lawyers, so we love a good disclaimer. If you're going to roll out something like the agency's participation in this project is not in any way an endorsement of, partner ABC, consider the context, consider whether people reading that endorsement might be might be receptive, might understand what that means. A disclaimer is not in and of itself something that can be waved away, but it's very useful in communicating that this is something we're doing and it's not an endorsement. Counseling, of course, is the bread and butter of a lot of ethics practice. And counseling is often a great tool for dealing with this. You might have a project partner, and using that kind of that licensing example, where you might have to really let your team know that, hey, you can go forward with this project, but you're going to have to be really careful that communications around the project don't contain anything that looks like this. And that may be effective. You need to know your own team, of course, in how effective that might be. Multiple sources. This is always a useful tool in dealing with endorsement fact patterns. But when there's more than one source involved in an initiative, when there's more than one project partner, it's less likely that any particular activity is going to be seen as endorsement in connection to that, because you have this group that's coming together rather than a specific entity. Of course, there are fact patterns where multiple sources could be endorsed simultaneously, but it's less likely if that's clear that this is a larger joint effort. And I'll talk about more of this in the next section, the clarity of public purpose. If it's clear what the public purpose of what you're doing is, it can be less troubling when something that maybe appears to be an endorsement or that somebody has a question about arises. So I'm moving on to the next slide in the next section, misuse of position. So I'm not going to read the whole 702, and those of you who have been playing in the space for a moment might note that my endorsement position, the previous section was also a 702 section, and am I really just doubling up on 702 here? And the answer is yes, I am. But in addition to that, there's specific ways that misuse of position can apply in the way the broader structure of how we think about misuse of position can come into play. And I'll draw your attention to the end of this little excerpt I have here. The specific prohibitions set forth in paragraphs A through D of this section apply this general standard, but are not intended to be exclusive or to limit application of this section. I have always looked at this position, I've always read this particular provision to understand that there is and coincident with the principles of ethical conduct, that there's not just a mandate to avoid technical violations of 702, that there's also a mandate to avoid the appearance, moving on to the next slide, of violations of 702, and understanding that that specific prohibitions in that section aren't the be all and end all of misuse of position. 702D to that end talk specifically about appearance and the applicability of 502 standards in assessing appearance issues. Again, there's more specific technical guidance to be given from OGE and through IEG on the subject of misuse of position. There's a lot of different dimensions here, but the bottom line is that when I'm looking at a misuse of position fact pattern, I am looking for appearance of misuse in addition to actual misuse. And when can that come up? Well, obviously, as 702D brings forward, if there is a potential conflict of interest or impartiality issue, that's going to be an issue that's obviously going to raise a misuse of position issue up front. And being able to identify that as a misuse issue gives you a better tool to communicate about it. Somebody who has a particular conflict of interest, or somebody who is dealing with an impartiality issue, is always going to want to understand their conflict in terms of, it's always useful to communicate that conflict in terms of appearance, because nobody by default thinks about their conflicts of interest as conflicts of interest. And when you're talking to an individual employee, they, many will understand themselves to be, ethical, upstanding people who, even if there's an appearance, would never do that. But that's, of course, not what the standards of ethical conduct compel us to account for. We also come up with misuse of position fact patterns potentially in assumed project benefits. And I talked about this a little bit in terms of clarity of public purpose in the previous section. Imagine a situation where you have a program where you want to distribute a particular set of information. You're entering into an agreement with a private party to do so. And your agency has judged this to be a really, really important and time-sensitive need to distribute information, but you need a cooperator, you need somebody to do it. So you figure out a way to sole source it permissibly with the rules, and it comes to you in terms of, hey, do you have any issues with this? Well, if it's not perfectly clear from the nature of the project documentation that the project benefit is what the agency's view of the benefit of this project to the public is, that would weigh against you in a misuse of position, in a situation where a misuse of position question comes up. The misuse of position, if you're thinking about the fact that the priority is urgent, it sometimes doesn't dawn to folks who are really deep in a particular fact pattern, whether or what the particular public benefit of a particular situation is. And that's making sure that folks on the ground are clarifying that, are being really upfront with their public purpose and putting that in the project documentation makes clear and can assist in some of these fact patterns. Again, so solutions are clarity of public purpose, and of course for the conflicts and impartiality, upfront recusals, and understanding that if a recusal can, understanding and being upfront with what recusals might need to take place to address a misuse of position issue. Former employees is one that comes up. I have the rules here. 18 U.S.C. 207 governs communication between the government and employees. The ethics pledge will be relevant for certain political appointees and extend those commitments. And of course, your own agency may have supplemental regulations or internal policies around communicating with former employees. The good news for us as ethics practitioner is that when a former employee is working closely on a project, the rules are firm. There's communications that aren't allowed to take place. Where you have consolidated expertise or subject matter expertise, or situations where there is a natural set of, if not even revolving doors, just people who have maybe even niche expertise on a particular issue, who've worked in government and outside government, understanding the rules, being very, very clear about what is permissible and isn't permissible. This is also a place where advising is perhaps a better tool than vetting, because understanding the nature of proposed project partners, who those people are and who those key project participants are, is going to give you the benefit of early and clear advice, so your role can be more collaborative and less in the way of giving a thumbs up or a thumbs down to a particular situation. So I'm going to move on to more general best practices. I've talked about specific ways to work through particular issues that arise under the standards. The best practices here, I'm just going to go through this kind of close to final slide a little more closely. The first one is open communication with management. As folks are proposing new initiatives and are focusing on how to communicate those, you're having open channels, having regular meetings where these things are discussed and where you are clear on what your management's priorities are in bringing these projects forward will make things much more clear. Again, talking about like public benefit as a tool in analyzing or helping with initiatives that might have potential 702 issues, it sometimes might not be clear to us as ethics practitioners who have a limited area of expertise what those are. You prevent yourself from being a roadblock by understanding those priorities up front. Establishing a clear role. Again, this gets back to that advising versus vetting role. Understanding what your role is in the process. If you are a more junior practitioner have an upfront role on your team, understanding that when you get a project here, am I advising? Am I part of the brainstorming? And am I part of the conception? Or is this something that is baked and I am vetting for whether or what needs to be like done to move this out the door? And understanding what is expected of you from both the people on the project line and from your ethics team in the first place is vital in providing good and the best advice that you can give. No shaming employees who get it wrong at first. Your employees, especially those who are primarily programmatic, who are leading or championing initiatives, are gung-ho and they may not focus on the same things you are focusing on. That does not mean that they are intending to violate things, and you should approach these with an open mind. However, we always disfavor our post hoc advice on a potential violation. There are channels that a potential violation should go through, and you should be clear with your DAO as to what those are and how to respond to those. Making sure that those fact patterns are developed, but making sure that when people come to you with problems, just as a matter of attitude, your team has an open mind, has a good record and understanding of active listening, of understanding how to develop the facts behind a potential situation, and guiding those employees appropriately when they come to you with a proposal that says, you know, hey, just to use the example from earlier, hey, we want to conduct a certification program. And you say that the way you're proposing this would violate 702. If you just shut it down up front, you're going to get an employee that's going to come to you less often in the future, unless you come to it with a more collaborative mindset. If you talk through, oh, well, we have to be concerned about these things. Is there a way we can do this differently that arrives at the same result? To that end, not just open communication with management, but having a face-to-face element between appropriate senior project officials. Understanding that ethics and the rules around these are often better communicated face-to-face when you are a person rather than the representative of a group of people. I admittedly come from a small agency where I think I have a pretty good working relationship with most of the employees that I work with on these types of things because I'm able to connect with many of them personally. At larger agencies, that may not be practical, but to the extent that those who are managing projects have face-to-face interaction with the ethics team, that can be a really useful tool to making sure that the information is being brought to you and you're not collecting or managing violations post hoc when an agency's activities can be considered upfront. And the other great tool here is new employee onboarding. Employee onboarding is a great time to talk about successes of the ethics program in agency initiatives. Small versus large agencies, that might be different. We do all of our onboarding in person, which we're able to do because we're a smaller agency. You might not be able to do that, but understanding that as part of onboarding, there's ways to communicate to people about the role that they play when they have certain programmatic items that you know are going to be in their portfolio. So for instance, the supervisory notices that OGE makes us send around to new supervisors, similar tools like that might be useful to let people know, hey, these are the types of issues we see from the ethics perspective that come up in project management and developing initiatives. Keep those in mind and come to us and talk through those first so you can avoid roadblocks down the way. So those are helpful up front so that when people are dreaming about what they will do in this job, they are also dreaming in line with the standards of ethical conduct, or at least they know where the pitfalls might be. And
hold on one second.
Gentle. Hello? Are we still?
I think we're okay.
Great, wonderful. This is actually the last thing, and we're closing. We'll close in and move on to Q&A right after this. A gentle discussion of consequences. It's not something that we want to dwell that I find is useful to dwell on in early conversations, because it is not a talking through the details of what a referral to your inspector general will look like is usually not a useful tool in fostering collaboration. But it is worth making sure that it's discussed at least a little bit early on, so people understand that the rules here do have stakes. But keeping it gentle and keeping it well understood, I found, is better than highlighting and keeping people's nerves up. It's more useful to a collaborative relationship to provide a gentle outline of what happens and to move on with a collaborative mindset. And to that end, I think it's time for the Q&A.